We come to the middle of our phase on art, and this is Art 6, and we're trying to appreciate by phases rather than by subject how our kind, how our species matures. And that the maturation process is one that has an ecology. It flows through stages that are quite definite. And in between the stages, there are transitions that are rather abrupt given the time duration of some of the phases. There was a wonderful book about 30 years ago called Passages by Gail Sheehy, of how one could identify not only the stages of life, but the particular passages that one went through to get to the next stage. Leaving infancy and going into childhood, leaving childhood, going into adolescence, from adolescence on, and so forth, that there's an ecology not only of stages, but of passages, of transitions. For this particular presentation, this is a learning where the phases are primordial. They have occurred universally, not only for our kind, but for any sentient species, and a further stage for sentient species that develop intelligence, and then a whole other cycle, a whole other ecology for those intelligent beings who have developed consciousness. We're looking at art, which is the first form that comes out of consciousness, comes out of vision. The two kinds of forms that previously were real came out of nature. And as we saw at the beginning of our learning in the first phase on nature, that nature is mysterious. Mysterious in the sense that existence seems not to come out of the natural mystery in parts, but always comes out in wholes. That if one characterized the existential fact of anything, it is a unity in the sense that it has oneness, and though it may have various parts or segments, it has a wholeness in its existence. And the second kind of form that comes out of nature is the objectivity of our symbolic minds. Art forms do not come out of nature, but they come out of transformed nature, where the mysteriousness of nature has given way to a different quality that used to be called, in very ancient times, used to be called magic. Or in less ancient times, in medieval times, it used to be called mystic. That somehow nature in its mysteriousness accepts, transforms that make it magical or make it mystical. And the difference between it is that magic has the quality where there is always a ritual operation that is able now to be brought into play, that the previous rituals that established existence and actuality now have a transformed symbolic capacity to make a super existence, a supernature. That symbolic quality has the ability to make ritual out of magical nature magical, but the mystic quality is there in the feeling tones, the images, the kind of language now that one can use The symbolic forms and the ritual forms are integral. They always bring things together. But art forms are not integral, they're differential. They display the jewel-like facets of something so it can be appreciated by a rotation or by a critique of its possibles, its spectrum. We're taking pairs of people constantly through our learning so that we can get a tuning quality of how the phases and the transitions between phases that I call intervals, how they actually work and how they operate. And we saw that in the natural ecology, in integration, where integrals are the mode of working, there is a pragmatic quality always to the way in which nature works. It really does work. But when we come to the ecology of consciousness, which complements nature, pragmatism is not the indexing quality of the mode. The indexing quality, instead of pragmatism, is prismatic. And so one could say that the symbol for consciousness is the rainbow. It is a prismatic rainbow of all the colors, whereas the integral symbol could be just light, and has been in the past many times, in many cultures, in many civilizations. One can say that the symbol of light is one of the master integrals of nature. And one can even later on develop that into understanding that the unity of the photon, the carrier of light, has a very real place in the universe, in that its dynamic establishes the index for the ultimate form and relationality of the universe, the speed of light. But the rainbow is different. It is light that has been differentiated, light that has been opened up, not just to its particular elements, but those elements are now graduated in a spectrum. And it's the ability of a prism to deliver the spectrum out of the symbolic unity. And so art forms are like this. What is the spectrum that they deliver? They deliver the spectrum of the conscious person who has not only gone through all the phases of the ecology of nature, but has entered into enough conscious visionary quality to change the operation of their mind and to transform the functioning of nature. And that with these two that are now changed, the kind of form that comes out of this is the traditional way to speak of it, the spiritual person. As distinct from a symbolic idea of individuality in the mind, as distinct from the character as the protagonist of our experience, as distinct from the figure in the ritual comportment. That the spirit is quite different from the body or the mind, but related to it in the sense that it is able to enter into the mind and transform it, and is able to enter into the body in an even more primordial way. While the spirit enters the mind at the center, the spirit enters the body from its original source nature. So that when someone has a spiritual body, the old saying was they have a body of light. In Iranian Sufism, which raised this whole symbolic expression to a very, very high point in the way in which Ibn Arabi, about 1300 AD, finally came to call it. It is like a visionary recital of the whole ecology of the real, and the spiritual person becomes masterful, not in the sense of lording it over the ecology of nature, but of being a complementary transform that can go into the mind and go into nature and thus re-emerge ritual existence in a completely new way. It isn't that it's modified, but that it re-emerges completely different. And the ancient way to speak of this, it's the difference between the caterpillar and the butterfly. And the cocoon allows the caterpillar to completely dissolve in its own juices and transform itself so that it comes out as a butterfly and not as a modified caterpillar, but a transformed caterpillar. And so this whole ecology passed many thousands of years ago into language. The ancient Greek term, psyche, suke in Greek, means the butterfly soul. It means that there has been a cocooning capacity in the mind that has allowed the previous body-mind relationship to dissolve in its own juices, not into oblivion, but to dissolve into a creative new mix. And what happens in that creative new mix is that the 4 dimensions of space and time gain a 5th dimension of consciousness, so that the mind now gives a rebirth, not a birth, but a rebirth, to a being that emerges out of a 5-dimensional play, a quintessential play. And as the spirit person emerges, they are like a work of art. And so art is one of the great harbingers of the spiritual maturity of the person. All cultures that go through the cocoon of symbolic realization have the ability to emerge with the wings of civilizations. We're taking Hiroshige, one of the great Japanese print artists, and we're taking Frank Lloyd Wright, one of the world's great architects. And we're trying to understand and appreciate at this stage in our learning about art how this actually works. And one of the greatest things about Hiroshige is that he burst upon the world scene in the most unlikely way. We talked last week about how his grandfather was one of the last of the samurai and taught archery, and how there wasn't much employment for such warriors in modern emerging Japan, and so the grandfather was admitted to a fireman's guild so he could earn his living without having to be a samurai archer. And that one of the things about the early firemen in places like Edo, where all the houses were made out of paper, and you didn't just have one building burned, but you had neighborhoods burn all of a sudden, is that they used to have these high towers to watch over views and vistas of places like Tokyo, then called Edo, or Kyoto. And so Hiroshige, his father became a fireman, he became a fireman, and he learned from his family tradition to mix 2 things that are coordinates. One is the archer's ability to look exactly where the target has its center, and the other, to frame a view so that you understand in a complete gestalt what it is that you're looking at, so that you can see all of it at the same time. And so he established the ability to have a penetrating pivot of penetration complemented by a composed symmetrical view. And he turned these double capacities into mastering the Japanese print in a way that was startling. And we talked last week, we'll talk next week a little bit more about the ancient landscape tradition in East Asia. We talked about how it's about 1,500 years old at this time, and that it underwent an enormous transform and change around 1200 AD. And around 1200 AD, born into China, were a handful of the greatest artists of all time who knew each other. And they were all landscape artists, but they were landscape artists at a time when China was being threatened and finally taken over by the Mongols, Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan. And so Chinese civilization, for the first time, was going to be dominated by a foreign people. And so the Chinese artists of that generation wanted to express something poignant about their particular penetrating pivot of person, the spirit of their person, and also the beauty of the Chinese landscape. And so you find Chinese landscapes in what is called the Southern Sung and then the Northern Sung, a dynasty. And one of the greatest artists of the day was named Ma Yuan. And the Chinese called him One Corner Ma because he would have a landscape scroll that would have mist in about 3/4 of it, and just down in one corner there would be something like gnarled pines with a gnarled rock, with an old man and a young man moving together in this mystical, magical, mysterious landscape. Another was named Sha Gua, and he was famous for the power of making his rocks and his trees so intense that you realized that the rest of the landscape were resonances of this intensity. These were not just rocks, they were the heaviest things in the universe, the most solid, that they made space-time itself quiver, and that the pines that would grow out of a Sha Gua rock boulder sequence were so capable with the power of life that they could emerge from solid rock and live there and be there. And so the Chinese of that era came to look upon landscape painting as the epitome of the expression of the mysterious nature transforming into the spiritual person in the magical landscape, so that one could have a complete vision of reality that no one could take from you. Hiroshige is one of the last great figures in that tradition. When his works came out originally, he didn't make them for the court, he didn't make them for the aristocrats or for the wealthy. His prints sold for literally pennies apiece. They were for the merchants, the men who carried burdens on their backs on all the roads of Japan delivering the goods, for the shopkeepers, for the poor people, that they would have something that they could paste up with a little rice paste in their hovels, in their huts, wherever it was. And so Hiroshige's world of prints are filled with common people, with the aspect of ordinary, base-level human beings living freely in landscapes, the views of which are some of the most beautiful in the world. But the penetrating point of spiritual focus is so profound that as soon as they were made known in a larger world, as soon as Japanese prints surfaced into Europe, all of a sudden, within a few years, you had some of the greatest artists of all time collecting Hiroshige prints. One of the collectors was Vincent van Gogh. And Van Gogh took this Hiroshige print of a plum tree in the Kamedo Garden, and these are in the notes, so you can get the notes later on. He made his own painting of that, and he also made his own painting of another Hiroshige print of the Great Bridge, the Ohashi Bridge And this print was in a series called 100 Prints of Edo. So you have Vincent van Gogh making copies of Hiroshige prints at the same time that you had someone like Claude Monet, who took this print from Hiroshige's Tokaido series and developed a whole series called Poplars. And Monet and Van Gogh became collectors of Hiroshige, just as we've seen that George O'Keeffe became a collector, and as we will see, the greatest collector was Frank Lloyd Wright. His book that we showed last week, and I have it here, I'll show after the break, on the Japanese print, was a culmination of several generations of his interest in the Japanese print, in particular Hiroshige. When one looks at Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, before he discovered the Japanese print, you get a quality where he is trying to raise buildings out of the prosaic landscape of the American Midwest. After he discovers the Japanese print, one finds a mystic quality, a magical transform of the mysteriousness of nature, where the artist re-enters into his own symbolic capacity of imagination and idea and is able to make a penetrating symbol that opens itself up very quickly to a set of primordialities, and that these primordialities then have a direct relationship with the landscape, so that the building that is made out of this not only has an integrity as a work of architecture, but it has an indelible place in its landscape. He once said, if a building is built right, you cannot imagine that building anywhere else in the world but right there, and you can't imagine that there without the building. One of the greatest examples of it is his house that he built for the Kaufman family just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, called Falling Water, called the greatest work of architecture of the 20th century, built in 1936. But you notice here the rendering of the house before it was built, showing it to Edgar Kaufman Sr., looks very much like a Hiroshige print, like a Japanese print. In fact, the renderings of Frank Lloyd Wright are now considered some of the greatest works of art in this kind of printmaking process, and it is the Japanese who published the great 12-volume edition of this. They went back and said, yes, Frank Lloyd Wright is one of us. He's as Japanese as we are. He feels like we feel. He thinks like we think. But he has done something. He has indicated to us that our way of feeling and our way of thinking has possibilities that opened us up to scales of spectrum of spiritual art and of historical consciousness and of scientific endeavor that we would never have had we not had this kind of a key, this kind of a clue. And one sees not only the influence of Japan on the West, but one sees the West's influence on Japan. One of the great examples of it, the United States had been making the best cars in the world until the Japanese began making cars, and now they make the best cars in the world because they make cars the way the Japanese have always made things. They get to the absolute simplicity. Frank Lloyd Wright said in his autobiography, plainness is not simplicity. He said, I learned early from my architectural mentor, Louis Sullivan, in the Chicago of the 1890s, that there's something here that is very important. Simplicity is being able to see to the center of what the full spectrum is and to appreciate that without any kind of extras. And that plainness is a reduction. It's as bad as if you had extras. So that there is an organic simplicity that includes everything that needs to be included in the ecology of the real. And that is a place always where not only can the body have its movement and the mind have its proportioning, but the spirit is also at home because it is free. And that it is able to go in and out of the house, into the landscape or out of the landscape, and that both house and landscape have this relationship of a penetrating pivot and a view of a symmetrical field. There is a particular quality to Hiroshige that allowed Frank Lloyd Wright especially to emerge from this. He had been interested in Japanese prints for about 15 to 20 years. And then he, having a wife and 6 children, very successful architect, had a crisis in his life where nothing seemed to be fulfilling anymore. And he built a house for a couple and then fell in love with the woman. And she fell in love with him. And they tried valiantly to hold apart and hold off, but they were like spirits that really belonged together. Out of this, Wright was trying to find a new way for him as an artist to mature beyond where he had gone, which was pretty far by that time. And so he went to Japan in 1906. And when he went to Japan, he discovered that he got along with the Japanese very well, especially the artists and the connoisseurs. And so they would open up their private collections to him on Japanese things, tansus as well as prints and so forth. And Wright established all these fantastic contacts. About that time, Japanese prints were not only influencing Van Gogh and Claude Debussy, Manet, Monet, Whistler, Klimt. I mean, the whole art world was bowled over by them. But there were several very wealthy collectors who decided to make collections of these kinds of prints. And so one of the wealthiest men and his son contacted Frank Lloyd Wright and said, "Would you buy prints for us?" And they made available, this is in the early 1900s, they made available $20,000 in a bank account for him to spend on Japanese prints. And they said, as part of your commission, you can keep which prints you like. In fairness, we trust you, and the rest convey to us. So when Wright came back, he went to Boston, and eventually that collection became the collection at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, one of the best collections of Japanese prints in the world. The rich father and son were bowled over by Wright, and they said, "Would you not go back and we'll make more money available to you?" And Wright said, "Well, it's getting very difficult to find prints. They were just thrown away before, and now they're collector's items." But Wright went back, and he spent $125,000 the second time. And when he brought the crates and crates and crates and crates, almost 10,000 prints back, it knocked out the entire East art world, Boston, New York, as well as Chicago. And out of this came an enormous change in aesthetic. And it was Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture that was the penetrating pivot that churned this entire development. One of the qualities that came out of it was his ability to change the whole nature of what a house might be. This is a very successful prairie house by Frank Lloyd Wright, built about 1902. And you can see immediately how within 20 years he was designing. This is the sketch for the Ennis House that's here in Los Angeles, up on Los Feliz Boulevard, on Glendower Boulevard above Los Feliz. And one of the greatest examples of architecture at that time was his ability to go through artistic transformations at such a rate that he literally outstripped his time by almost 100 years. By 1928, he was designing complexes like this in the Arizona desert. This is 75 years ago. He was designing buildings like that. Not just houses, but whole complexes. And out of the complexes, he emphasized that one could have a whole new dimension, not only of the house and of the building, but of the city, that the entire city could be redone. And so he designed the Monona Terrace Civic Center for Madison, Wisconsin, which finally was built about 5 years ago, almost 70-some years after he designed it. But they watered it down so much that one can see it isn't very much Frank Lloyd Wright anymore. But he put out a series of 3 books that would allow for someone to graduate themselves through levels to appreciate that there was a whole new scale of spiritual architecture possible. The first was called The Natural House. The second was called The Disappearing City. And the third had to do with the scale of architecture of man in possession of his earth to such an extent that man now was doing something that was not just supernatural, but was spiritually resonant with a future that was magically and mystically being teased into being by the penetrating pivot of the artists and by the scientific view of the extension of the resonance of that consciousness. And so he designed a house in Hollywood for Huntington Hartford, who owned a theater. And this is 1947, and it looks distinctly like flying saucers that appeared in 1947. There's another view in here of the Huntington Hartford house that was designed. This is 1947. And so he was, by this time, in 1947, Frank Lloyd Wright was 80 years old. He was just beginning to build. He built and designed more than 700 architectural structures. If you know anything about architectural practice, it is Herculean to design 700 buildings of all sizes. One of the qualities that was there was the ability to take the Japanese print in a whole new direction. This is a house he designed for Herbert Johnson, whose family owned Johnson & Johnson products, baby products and so forth, and for whom he built in 1936 in Racine, Wisconsin, we'll see it next week, the Johnson's Wax building, and followed it up by another structure that went with it that still today set the standard for the technical exploration of new materials. The Johnson's Wax building uses luminescent glass tubing instead of concrete for a lot of its structural elements. An architect, a very jealous, great architect, Philip Johnson, once said in an interview about 3 or 4 years ago, he said, well, we all disliked Wright, frankly, because we were jealous of him. Because when you went into the workspace of the Johnson's Wax building, you were dumbfounded, because for the first time you realized that all of us had been building like with little blocks, like school children, whereas Wright was an artist and he was creating something where all the fluted columns looked like gigantic lily pads that were holding up a translucent glass ceiling with balconies running around, and everyone, Johnson said, they had a hard time getting people to go home because they wanted to stay there. They loved being in the space. The same quality of the Johnson's wax building on the inside was done by Claude Monet because of Hiroshige on the outside. As soon as he began to realize that he could look with the penetration and the symmetrical view of Hiroshige, Claude Monet purchased a place called Giverny, and he started to garden there, and the center of the garden was a lily pond. And he put over the lily pond a curving arched bridge, because one of Hiroshige's prints he really liked was called the Drum Bridge. And this drum bridge is painted over and over again in Monet for the last 30, 35 years of his life. And the very last great work of his life was a painting so large it had to have its own building called Lily Pads. And it runs for hundreds of feet of painting of lily pads, and one sees the Western development of Hiroshige like Frank Lloyd Wright in the old Claude Monet. He died in 1926. Not only Impressionism in Europe, in France especially, but in the United States, what became affected by it was an immense realization that some of the transcendentalists, like Emerson and Thoreau and Margaret Fuller, had developed a very similar kind of a source of transcendent consciousness, only they had thought that this was just a mystical level, that one would get into a transcendence and then in some kind of semi-trance, one would be able to come back into the body and into the mind. What the East Asian art tradition showed, especially in people like Hiroshige, is that if you take it and let a form emerge out of that transcendence, it is no longer transcendental, but it is operational in transformation. And the two things that transform readily are the center of the mind and the whole flow of nature. Because the center of the mind and the whole flow of nature occupy a very, very interesting quality in common, in tandem. They occupy what the Chinese used to call Tao. And that Tao has a peculiar pair of expressions that are completely interchangeable. One is the zeroness, the emptiness of zero. The other is the complete fullness of infinity. The mind can be completely empty or completely full and be in the same state, which is in a absorbed nature which is mysteriously able to deliver the real. Let's take a little break. This is a print from Hiroshige's first great series, 55 Japanese prints in a series that were illustrations of the beginning and the end, and in between the 53 stages on one of the first really royal superhighways in Japan called the Tokaido. It was finished in 1832. Fast runners could go from Edo to Tokyo, 320 miles in 4 days. They were like marathon runners running day and night with Pony Express. And if you can imagine that in 1830 that you could go 320 miles in 4 days, the popularity of the Tokaido became one of carrying power in Japan. It's like one of the first super highways in the world, and was an indication in the American West that the Pony Express could be replaced by a continental railroad. And part of the American response was, let's not just build a road for people to ride horses on and run on, let's build a road where railroads span the entire continent very quickly. This is stage number 11 of the Tokaido Prince, done about 1834, and it's called Hakone. And you can see this is one of the roughest spots on the Tokaido route. They had trouble getting horses over this pass because it was so rugged and steep. And part of the technique was to let a bunch of people collect together, and then they would tie themselves like mountain climbers together or hold on together, and they would go in long files of people over this pass. And you can see here that Hiroshige is showing what an incredible difficulty it was, and yet the flow of human beings is like a secret mystic sap in the midst of the most dangerous and rough wildernesses. In the Tokaido series, there's a print later on, number 47. Hakone is number 11. This is number 47. It's called Kamiyama. And you see this parade of people again, but this time it is less steep, but is in wintertime. And the file of people is like a living diagonal in the midst of a receding snowy wilderness, capped by one of the fortress castles of power in shogunate Japan. These two prints, which are similar but occupying different parts. Kamiyama is just 8 or 9 prints from the end. Hakone is the 11th end from the beginning. And so you begin to see it's not machine perfect, but there's a symmetry in what Hiroshige was developing. And the symmetry is related to the two different qualities, the two different coordinates that a prismatic conscious form will have. It will have a center that penetrates beyond the centerness and allows for multiple layers to be put into a spectrum of depth together, so that what would have been a center in integration becomes a pivot in prismatic development. It's like the axis of a crystal is the axis of its piezoelectric or magnetic energy and fields, and one can do many things in the 21st century knowing this. In the latest issue of Nature, the international magazine for science, there's an article about a man who developed the piezoelectric capacity of crystals to make very minute tabletop room temperature fusion power. We're beginning to understand how to do lots that would have been impossible before. Fusion is a higher power than fission. Stars go by fusion power. You can do this in a very minute little crystal on top of a tabletop at room temperature using about 2 watts of power. The other quality that's there is that instead of the target leading to a center, you have the pivot, which generates then a kaleidoscopic possibility of fields. And out of that kaleidoscopic possibility of fields, any forms that come out will have that kaleidoscopic, infinite faceted quality, so that the human spiritual person who emerges has an infinite kaleidoscope of facets that they can access. Unlimited, unbounded, literally. When art comes into play as a phase, it tends to transform, and by its transformation to displace ritual. So that art and ritual have a curious relationship. It's like the relationship of vision to nature. But whereas nature gives way to conscious vision naturally, ritual does not. It likes to dig in and keep things the way it is. Because if you don't keep things the way it is, then you're going to transgress the existential limits that were necessary to keep that form real. And if you do that, what's going to happen to reality? And so a completely different quality of prismatic form comes into play. And when it comes into play, one of its conscientious prismatic qualities is that it doesn't just displace the previous, but it enters into a complementarity with it. So now that you have something completely new, like the butterfly. One of the best ancient historical examples of this is that in ancient Iran, about 2000 BC, the central god was Ahura. And the sacrifices in the ceremonies by the magi, priests, were very precise. One could not transgress. And the various costumes, the apron and so forth, were very precise and all prescribed. But when Zarathustra came into his radiant conscious person, he saw that this was a beginning at that time which now could be transformed into something new, and out of this came Mazda. The splendor of the radiance of reality, and instead of Mazda just replacing Ahura, he put them together and you have Ahura Mazda. And out of that, out of Zarathustra's early yasts, they're called, the Gathas, one has this conscious vision, not only the vision, but brought into a new art form. The songs of Zarathustra are a 4,000-year-old art form, a sequence of songs that together make a new necklace of kaleidoscopic consciousness. And it established one of the high watermarks in world history at the time, still. When Frank Lloyd Wright was about 9 years old, his mother, who was really a refined person, came from a rather significant family that were filled with arrogant or aggressive or very powerful people. Their motto was truth against the world. And they used the old Druid symbol of 3 notches, 3 lines, to be the symbol of the family. Their family was Lloyd Jones, hyphenated. And his mother was Anna Lloyd Jones Wright. And she married a man who was very unsuccessful in business, in several types of business, and finally wanted to go into the family business of being preachers. Only he preferred Baptist kind of preaching, whereas the Lloyd Jones people favored Unitarianism, Unitarian transcendental Emerson things. And eventually they moved from the east, where they had moved. Wright was born in Wisconsin, in a little place called Richland Center, not very far from the valley called Spring Green, where the Lloyd Joneses owned most of the big farms and had everything together, where the Wisconsin River comes in a very broad, beautiful swath through low rolling hills, beautiful farmland. They had moved quickly from Richland Center, which is just about 10, 15 miles north of that, to the East Coast. And then they moved back to Wisconsin, but not to the farmlands, but to Madison, the capital, where the University of Wisconsin was. And it's there at the University of Wisconsin fringes that Frank Lloyd Wright as a child grew up. And when he was about 9, his mother saw an exhibit of a series of educational tools, or educational toys, if you like, called the Gifts. And he says in his autobiography, "At the Centennial in Philadelphia, after a sightseeing day, Mother made a discovery. She was eager about it now, could hardly wait to go to Boston as soon as she got home. The kindergarten. She had seen, because the kindergarten was developed out of a series of educational tools called the Gifts, done by a man named Froebel. She had seen the Gifts in the Exposition Building in Philadelphia, the strips of colored paper, glazed and matte, shiny and matte finished, remarkably soft, brilliant colors. Now came the geometric byplay of those charming checkered color combinations, the structural figures to be made with peas and small straight sticks, slender constructions, the joinings accented by little green pea globes, the smooth, shapely maple blocks with which to build, the sense of which never afterward leaves the fingers. Form becomes feeling. The box had a mast to set it up on, over which to hang the maple cubes and spheres and triangles, revolving them to discover subordinate forms." And so he was introduced to the way in which forms and colors are available for play, free play. And out of the free play, he learned that the touch, the hand, learns as well as the mind. When I was a boy, one of the sayings in the American Midwest was, it was so apparent that a blind man could see it with his cane. That the kinesthetic touch of the body carries with it a field of awareness that is one of the substrates of all experience. And it's that substrate of experience that when it goes into its maturity becomes consciousness. That the awareness of the body kinesthetically can be matured so that the mind opens itself to a particular spirit touch. And that is the realm of consciousness. And so awareness and consciousness have a relationship like a child in its play and a mature spirit being in its play. But its play now is not just creating within nature, but understanding that nature now has possibilities and can create extensions, expansions of nature. Not supernatural, but supranatural in the sense that it doesn't add to it, but it expands what is real. And so man becomes a creator as well. And creates then something which is a resonance of the reality of nature, and that is the harmonic of possible cosmos. And it is this that Wright, from age 9 on, began to understand and play. There is a whole series of books that came out in the 19th century in America, the International Education Series, all devoted to the development of Froebel's developments in education. He was born in 1782, and for the 100th year anniversary, they put out a whole series of books. This one is by him called The Education of Man. And in The Education of Man, at the very beginning, they say, the work of Froebel admits us into his philosophy and shows us the fundamental principles upon which he based the kindergarten system. He made the kindergarten. His great word is interconnection. There must be an interconnection between the pupil's mind and the objects which he studies, and this shall determine what to study. So that the mind, in its integration of experience, which has been generated by the body in its existential actions, which has come out of the mystery of dynamic nature, the substrate of the mind carries with it the awareness touch of the free play, so that when the mind matures itself, there is an interconnection which is stronger than the inculcated habit impositions that have been given the child. But in order for that interconnection to have its play reality, it needs to overcome the sediment that have been imposed upon it by external habit, external doctrines, inculcations, instruction. And to overcome that, it needs to have a way to dissolve the glue. It is spiritual consciousness that provides the gentle dissolving of that glue and frees the substrate of the mind to play again with the freedom of the body in its kinesthetic touch of the awareness of reality. So it reads, there must be an interconnection. This was published in 1887. Between the pupil's mind and the objects which he studies, and this shall determine what to study. There must be an interconnection in those objects among themselves, which determines their succession and the order in which they are taken up in the course of instruction. In ancient Iran, the sense of universal order was carried by Asha. She carries that order as her reality, and whenever one is able to come into contact with Asha, the order is there, is manifest. Finally, there's an interconnection within the soul that unites the faculties of feeling, perception, fantasy, thought, volition, and determines the law of their unfolding, how they play out, and that they do not play out in habitual scenarios. They do not play out in doctrine instructions. Those inhibit the unfolding, so that what you get is the necessity to specify the unwrapping of each stage ad infinitum into a reductio absurdity. And one ends up finally in a complexity that ends up in limbo because you can't specify every single thing. Whereas you don't have to at all. That a real education frees the play of the body's awareness in its kinesthetic existentiality to play as the substrate for the integrating mind that doesn't integrate down to points of doctrine, but integrates down to openness that allows for, through that transparency, the play of consciousness to go both ways. And what consciousness essentially is in its process is remembering. Not just visioning, but remembering. The old saying is, when you've had a vision, write down what you've seen in a book. Tell this around the campfires to the others. A vision is not there just for a selfish individuality, but to share. One is given a great vision to convey that to others. And so there's an inter-individuality quality to the personal, which gives it a faceted form, which is just as objective as the mind in its symbolic center, just as objective as existent objects in the universe. When consciousness, as remembering, enters into the form of the mind, it becomes memory, becomes the memory. It achieves the ability to have an integral form way of dealing. And what was there as the integral form of dealing previous to that is the imagination, integrated from images, integrated from feeling, integrated from language and the way language generates meaning. And so the center of imagination now exchanges its place with the center of remembering. And as remembering becomes the memory in the mind, the imagination becomes creative imagining in visionary consciousness. And the artist uses both. Uses the conscious visioning dynamic, but uses the center of creative imagining to work with it. And so one gets the capacity to develop art. We're going to go into this more next week. The gifts of Froebel were the forerunners of a further maturing. The gifts were the tools or toys to be used in kindergarten, and then the grade schools were developed in further powers of what would come out of them called the occupations. And one of the qualities of the occupations is that it had a substrate flow called mother play. And there are whole books on Froebel's occupations and on the mother play. And there is a literature that is largely forgotten in our time, but when you're dealing, as we are here, with reformulating education so that we can have a new civilization and get our spirit persons back into health again, we have to look at all of this and refresh it, bring it back out. Wright's ability to envision was so creative that he began to outstrip his time, not just by a couple of decades, but increasingly by almost a century, and towards the end of his life, he probably outstripped the capacity for architecture by almost a couple of hundred years. We live in the 21st century where the pride of power in the world now is to build tall buildings. There's a building in Abu Dhabi that is almost 2,000 feet high. There are buildings in Kuala Lumpur, the Pele Towers, that are 130 stories tall. The CNN Tower in Toronto is 1,800 feet tall. 50 years ago, Frank Lloyd designed a building to be built in Chicago that was 520 stories tall. It's called the Mile High, Illinois. No one can build it even yet. This is a building that he envisioned in 1943 to be built in New York City, on Fifth Avenue, called the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. This is his original rendering sketch. It took a while to build it. It took 16 years to build it. It wasn't finished until 1959. And his whole vision of this is that this is a building for spiritually free artistic persons to play with real works of art within a work of art that was like a reminder pilot light in the very center of New York City that all this is real. We really are spirits. We really are free, but not free to have choices, but free kaleidoscopically into infinity, a whole different scale of freedom. In the Guggenheim Museum, one goes to the top of an atrium that goes all the way up to a dome that has these beautiful circular prismatic qualities to it. One starts at the top and comes in a spiral all the way down in a free place so that the space never has a wall. It only has this kind of spiraling quality where it isn't a boundary, because that's where the works of art are. And as one comes down the ramps, it invites high play, spirit play, so that one is not looking to see an object physically in perception, nor even to appraise an object conceptually in a mental, judgmental way, but one experiences the aesthetic play that your reality now gains the butterfly wings of a freed psyche. And that this is not only your natural heritage, it is your supranatural actuality. In Plotinus, in one of his great writings about 1800 years ago, he said, there is a quality where the soul regrows its wings and is able to fly. And when one does this, one realizes that the openness of the space is not a threat. It's a further environment in which to be free. There is in Hiroshige the sense that in between the two realms, there is definitely a bridging that goes on. And Monet's drum bridge at Giverny is one example of it. In Hiroshige, in the Tokaido series, there are bridges everywhere, but in particular, the first view is the great bridge in Tokyo, the Nihonbashi. And in the last print, it's the great bridge in Kyoto. But in the center of the Tokaido, in the 29th, is this bridge. And this bridge has a figure walking on it, and that figure is Basho, with his great traveling companion Sora. And when we went into our education, our learning last year, we took Basho's Zen travelogue, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, and we saw that Basho was also from a samurai family, but instead of using ink brush to make Japanese prints, he used an ink brush to make a special kind of language, a kind of a samurai grammar and syntax to language that had never been seen in the world before. And so he would write his Zen travelogue in a certain simple, not plain, but simple way, and he would come to a juncture where he would stop, and before he would start again, in that gap, he put a new form of poetry called the haiku. And Basho's creation of the haiku, where it is not at all a stanza, it's not a quatrain, it's not the traditional 31-syllable short Japanese poem, it's only the first 17 syllables that one could say in a single breath. And the 17 is very interesting because in the deep meditation experience of the historical Buddha, in several of his sutras, in order to disclose that there is a structure which can be known with specificity and that there is a dynamic that cannot be separated, he showed that there were 16 parts to a moment of thought. That the atomic structure of a moment of thought, the smallest time flick of a moment of thought, has 16 parts, 8 of which can be designated individually, and the other 8 always occur as a trill. They never occur singly. They always occur as a trill. So that the pair, that reality is always paired. A dynamic that is a flow is always paired with a form that has a definite, discernible structure, and that the two together constitute reality. The penetrating axis of the pivot and the dynamic field of the view, they always go together. In the center of the Tokaido prints, he put this Basho coming over the bridge, And in the background were the kites that were flying. And all the people in the field and on the bridge are bowing to the gentle reality that Basho is presenting in his spiritual self. And one of the kites is free. The string has snapped and it goes free. I remember as a boy, I was about 8 years old. I'd been born premature by several months and so was asthmatic and bronchial from birth and was near death as a boy because there were no more medicines that could be given. I was immune physically to them. I would just throw up. So my parents moved me to the Mojave Desert at age 8 in the San Gorgonio Pass, Banning. And I remember the first time that I felt healthy enough to realize I was going to live. And it occurred to me, well, then what will I do if I'm going to live? And at the time that that happened, I was flying a box kite in the San Gorgonio Pass in our backyard in Banning. And I had been so ebullient that I kept tying more and more balls of string until finally it was very, very far up, and the big winds that blow through the San Gorgonio Pass were really catching it. And I was called into supper. My father and several of his business associates. And I said, I can't get my kite back. And I remember them coming out until there were about 5 men trying to pull on that string. And finally, they realized they couldn't pull it in, and it had to be cut loose. And I remember seeing, just like that Hiroshige print, if you get into the high winds of truth, they have to cut you loose. They can never pull you back. More next week.